The winter wind cut through Sarah Martinez like a blade as she pressed herself against the rough bark of the old pine tree. Her bare feet had gone numb 20 minutes ago, but she could still feel the sting of each step she had taken through the snow. The thin cotton dress that had seemed adequate in the warm ranch house now offered no protection against the bitter Montana cold. She pulled her arms tighter around her chest and tried to stop her teeth from chattering. The sound might give her away, and she couldn't afford that. Not when Jake Morrison and his men were still looking for her. Sarah had worked at the Double M Ranch for 3 years. She came to Montana from Texas after her father died, leaving her with nothing but debt and a strong back for hard work. The job at the ranch paid decent wages, and the work suited her. She knew horses better than most men, and she wasn't afraid of long days or difficult tasks. Everything changed when she stumbled across something she wasn't supposed to see. It was supposed to be a routine evening. Sarah had finished her work in the stables and was walking back to the bunkhouse when she heard voices from the main ranch office. The window was cracked open despite the cold, and the voices carried clearly in the still air. "The cattle aren't really sick," Jake Morrison was saying. His voice had that cold edge Sarah had learned to fear over the past few months. But the insurance company doesn't know that. All they see is the paperwork saying we lost 200 head to disease. Another voice, one Sarah recognized as belonging to Frank Butler, Morrison's foreman, replied, "What about the actual cattle? People are going to notice when those same animals show up at auction houses in Wyoming." Morrison laughed, but there was no humor in it. Different brands, different paperwork. My brother's got connections down there. By the time anyone figures it out, if they ever do, the money will be long gone and scattered across half a dozen accounts. Sarah felt her stomach drop. Insurance fraud was serious business, and involving stolen cattle made it even worse. She started to back away from the window, but her foot hit a bucket that someone had left beside the building. The metal clanged against the wooden wall. The voices inside stopped immediately. Sarah didn't wait to see if anyone would come looking. She ran toward the bunkhouse, hoping that the sound hadn't been loud enough to really alert them. But when she reached her small room, she found Jake Morrison already there, sitting on her narrow bed with 2 of his men flanking him. "Evening, Sarah," Morrison said. His voice was calm, but his eyes were hard as winter stone. Funny thing about sound on a cold night. It carries real well. Sarah's mouth went dry. Morrison was a big man, well over 6 feet, with hands that had seen plenty of hard work and harder fighting. His expensive clothes and clean-shaven face couldn't hide the fact that he was dangerous. The men with him, Frank Butler and Tom Hayes, were cut from the same cloth. "I don't know what you mean, Mr. Morrison," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. Morrison stood up slowly. "I think you do. The question is, what are we going to do about it?" For a moment, nobody moved. Then Morrison nodded to his men, and everything happened fast. Butler grabbed Sarah's arms, while Hayes covered her mouth. She tried to fight, but they were both bigger and stronger. Morrison walked over to the small wood stove in the corner and picked up the poker. "You've been a good worker, Sarah," he said, testing the weight of the iron rod. "Reliable. Quiet. I'd hate to lose someone like that over a simple misunderstanding." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She could smell the fierce sweat on her own skin despite the cold. Morrison continued, "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to forget what you think you heard tonight. You're going to keep working here like nothing happened. And you're going to keep your mouth shut. Because if you don't, if you even think about talking to the sheriff or anyone else, I'll make sure you disappear so completely that they'll never find enough pieces to bury." He brought the poker close to her face. The metal was still warm from the fire. "Do we understand each other?" Sarah nodded frantically. Hayes released his hand from her mouth. "Yes," she gasped. "Yes, I understand." Morrison smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Good. I'm glad we could work this out." They left her alone then, but Sarah knew it wasn't over. Morrison might have accepted her promise for now, but men like him didn't leave loose ends. She would have to run, and soon. Sarah spent the next hour packing what little she owned into a small bag. She had some money saved up, enough for a train ticket to somewhere far away. Colorado, maybe, or California. Somewhere Morrison's reach couldn't follow. She waited until well after midnight before trying to leave. The ranch house was dark, and the bunkhouse was quiet. Sarah slipped out through the back door and started walking toward the main road, where she could catch the morning stage to town and then the train. She almost made it. The men came out of nowhere, surrounding her before she had a chance to run. Morrison was with them, along with Butler, Hayes, and 2 others she didn't recognize. "Going somewhere, Sarah?" Morrison asked. Sarah's bag fell from nerveless fingers. I couldn't sleep. I wanted some air." Morrison picked up her bag and looked inside. "Funny kind of air walk, with all your belongings packed up." He handed the bag to Butler and stepped closer to Sarah. "I thought we had an understanding." "We did," Sarah said quickly. "We do. I wasn't running. Morrison hit her. The blow knocked her to the ground and left her ears ringing. When her vision cleared, Morrison was standing over her. "Don't lie to me," he said. "I've dealt with plenty of liars in my time, and I can spot them easy as breathing." He turned to his men. "Take her boots." Sarah didn't understand at first. Then Hayes and one of the other men grabbed her feet and started pulling off her boots and socks. The cold bit into her bare skin immediately. "You want to run?" Morrison said. "Fine, run, but you're going to do it the hard way." They dragged her to her feet. Morrison pointed toward the forest that bordered the eastern edge of the ranch. "That way. Start walking." "Mr. Morrison, please," Sarah begged. "It's freezing out here. I'll die." "Maybe," Morrison said. "Or maybe you'll learn to keep your mouth shut and your nose out of other people's business." Butler shoved her forward. "Get moving." Sarah had no choice but to walk. The snow was deep enough to reach her ankles, and every step sent spikes of cold pain through her feet. Behind her, she could hear Morrison and his men following, their horses moving slowly to match her pace. They drove her deeper into the forest, past the marked trails, and into the wild country where few people ever ventured. Sarah's feet were bleeding now, leaving dark spots in the white snow, but Morrison showed no signs of stopping. After what felt like hours, Morrison finally called a halt. They were in a small clearing surrounded by tall pines. The snow here was undisturbed except for the tracks of wild animals. "This is far enough," Morrison said. He dismounted and walked over to where Sarah stood, swaying on her feet. "You've got 2 choices now. You can keep walking that way." He pointed deeper into the forest, "and take your chances with the cold and the wolves. Or you can turn around and walk back toward the ranch, and we'll have another conversation about keeping secrets." Sarah looked in the direction he pointed. The forest stretched on for miles with no roads, no houses, no help of any kind. In her current condition, with no shoes and inadequate clothing, trying to cross it would be suicide. But going back meant facing Morrison's version of justice, which might be worse than freezing. "What's it going to be, Sarah?" Morrison asked. Sarah looked at the faces surrounding her. Morrison, Butler, Hayes, and the 2 strangers all watched her with the same cold interest. She realized that Morrison had never intended to let her live, regardless of what choice she made. This whole thing was just his way of having some fun before he killed her. That understanding gave her a strange kind of clarity. If she was going to die anyway, she might as well make it on her own terms. "I'll take the forest," she said. Morrison looked surprised. "You sure about that? It's a cold way to die." "Better than letting you do it," Sarah replied. Morrison's face darkened. "Have it your way." They watched her walk away into the trees. Sarah forced herself to move steadily, even though each step was agony. She could feel them watching until the forest swallowed her up, and she was alone with the cold and the darkness. But Sarah Martinez had grown up hard, and she was tougher than Morrison gave her credit for. She had also spent 3 years learning every inch of the Double M Ranch and the surrounding country. Morrison might think he had sent her to die in the middle of nowhere, but Sarah knew where she was. About 2 miles ahead, if she could make it that far, was an old trapper's cabin that hadn't been used in years. She had discovered it during her second summer at the ranch while tracking down some strayed horses. The cabin was small and run down, but it had a roof and walls that would block the wind. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself and kept walking. Her feet had gone completely numb, which was probably a blessing. She couldn't feel the cuts anymore or the cold. She just had to put one foot in front of the other and keep moving. The trees around her creaked and swayed in the wind. Snow fell from their branches to dust her shoulders and hair. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, and Sarah tried not to think about what would happen if a pack picked up her scent. She stumbled and fell several times, but each time she forced herself to get up and keep going. The cold was making her drowsy, and she knew that was dangerous. People who lay down in snow this cold didn't get back up. Just when Sarah thought she couldn't take another step, she saw a dark shape through the trees ahead. The cabin looked even more run down than she remembered, with gaps in the walls and part of the roof sagging, but it was shelter. The door was stuck, warped by years of weather and neglect. Sarah threw her shoulder against it until it gave way with a loud crack. The inside of the cabin was dark and cold, but it blocked the wind. Sarah felt around until she found the old stone fireplace. There was some dry wood stacked beside it, left by the last person to use the place. Her hands were too numb to work properly, but she managed to get a small fire started using matches from a tin box on the mantel. As warmth began to fill the small room, Sarah examined her feet by firelight. They were cut and bruised, but not as badly damaged as she had feared. She found some old rags in the cabin and wrapped them around her feet for protection. The fire made her feel human again, but Sarah knew she wasn't safe yet. Morrison would expect her to die in the forest, but when her body didn't turn up come spring, he might start wondering. And if he suspected she was still alive, he would come looking. Sarah needed help, and she needed it from someone Morrison couldn't intimidate or buy off. The problem was most of the people in this part of Montana either worked for Morrison or depended on his goodwill in some way. The Double M Ranch was the biggest operation in the area, and Morrison had money and influence. But there was one person who might help her, someone Morrison couldn't touch. 3 valleys over, there was another ranch called the Circle 7. It was owned by a man named Daniel Cross, who had a reputation for being fair and honest. More importantly, Cross and Morrison had been feuding for years over water rights and boundary disputes. Cross had no love for Jake Morrison, and he might be willing to help someone Morrison had wronged. The problem was getting there alive. The Circle 7 Ranch was at least 15 miles away through rough country, and Sarah was in no condition for that kind of journey. She needed time to heal and prepare. She also needed to stay hidden. Morrison's men knew this country almost as well as she did, and they might come looking for her body when the snow melted. She had to make sure they wouldn't find the cabin. Over the next few days, Sarah worked to improve her situation. She found an old pair of boots in the cabin that were too big for her, but better than nothing. She melted snow for water and foraged for anything edible in the surrounding forest. There wasn't much available in winter, but she found some pine nuts and a cache of acorns that squirrels had stored in a hollow tree. Most importantly, she worked on covering her tracks. Sarah swept snow over the path leading to the cabin and used pine branches to disguise the smoke from her fire. She only went outside when necessary, and she always took a roundabout route to confuse any tracker who might follow her trail. On the 4th day, her precautions paid off. Sarah was warming her hands by the fire when she heard voices outside. She quickly smothered the flames and pressed herself against the wall beside the window, peering out through a gap in the boards. Frank Butler and Tom Hayes were standing about 50 yards away, examining the ground. They had found some of her tracks despite her efforts to hide them. "Trail goes cold here," Butler was saying. "Could be the wind covered it up." Hayes looked around at the surrounding trees. Or she could be holed up somewhere nearby. Sarah's heart hammered as Butler walked closer to the cabin. If he looked carefully at the door, he would see that it had been forced recently. The broken wood was still fresh and bright. Butler stopped about 10 feet from the door and turn in a slow circle. Sarah held her breath and tried to make herself invisible. "Nothing here," Butler said finally. "Let's check the creek bed." They moved away, and Sarah sagged with relief. But she knew they would be back, probably with more men. Morrison wasn't the type to give up easily. That night, Sarah made her decision. She couldn't stay in the cabin any longer. She had to risk the journey to Circle 7 Ranch, even if it killed her. She spent her last day preparing for the trip. Sarah wrapped her feet in layers of rags for extra warmth and protection. She gathered every scrap of food she could find and melted snow to fill an old canteen she discovered in the cabin. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Just before dawn on the 6th day, Sarah set out for Circle 7 Ranch. The journey was even harder than she had expected. The terrain between the two ranches was rough and mountainous, with steep ridges and deep valleys. Sarah had to move carefully to avoid leaving obvious tracks, which meant taking longer routes and staying off the main trails. By noon, she was exhausted and her makeshift boots were falling apart. Sarah stopped to rest in a grove of aspen trees and tried to patch the boots with strips torn from her dress. While she worked, she heard the sound of horses approaching. Sarah scrambled up the nearest tree and hid among the branches just as 3 riders came into view. She recognized one of them as Tom Hayes, but the other 2 were strangers. They were clearly searching for something, scanning the ground and the surrounding forest with careful attention. "Boss says she's got to be dead by now," one of the strangers said. "Nobody could survive this long out here without proper gear." Hayes spat into the snow. "Boss wants to be sure. We keep looking until we find a body." They moved on, but Sarah waited a long time before climbing down from the tree. Morrison's men were still hunting for her, which meant she was still in danger. But it also meant they hadn't found her body, which gave her hope. Sarah pressed on, forcing her tired legs to keep moving. The sun was getting low in the sky, and she needed to find shelter for the night. Spending a night in the open without a fire would likely kill her. Just as darkness was falling, Sarah crested a ridge and saw lights in the distance. It was a ranch, but she couldn't tell if it was Circle 7 or another spread. She had lost her bearings sometime during the afternoon and wasn't sure exactly where she was. Sarah approached carefully, staying hidden in the trees until she could get a better look at the buildings. As she got closer, she could see cattle in the fields and men working around the barns. The setup looked prosperous and well-maintained, which was encouraging. Finally, Sarah spotted a sign hanging over the main gate, Circle 7 Ranch. She had made it, but even as relief flooded through her, Sarah hesitated. She was about to gamble her life on the hope that Daniel Cross was the kind of man people said he was. If she was wrong, if Cross was in Morrison's pocket or simply didn't want to get involved, she would be delivered right back into Morrison's hands. Sarah thought about her alternatives and realized she didn't have any. This was her only chance. She took a deep breath and walked toward the ranch house. The front door opened before she could knock. A tall man with graying hair and intelligent eyes looked her up and down, taking in her torn dress, makeshift boots, and exhausted condition. "You must be the ghost," he said quietly. Sarah stared at him. "I am sorry." The man stepped back and gestured for her to come inside. "Daniel Cross. And you're the woman Jake Morrison thinks he killed 6 days ago." Sarah entered the warm house on shaking legs. "How did you—" Cross closed the door and led her to a chair near the fireplace. Word travels fast in this country, especially when a ranch hand goes missing under suspicious circumstances. "Morrison's been telling anyone who'll listen that you ran off with some cowboy, but his men have been combing the forest like they're looking for a body." A woman appeared from another room, carrying blankets and a steaming cup. She was about Cross's age, with kind eyes and gentle hands that helped Sarah wrap the blankets around her shoulders. "This is my wife, Mary," Cross said. "Mary, this is our ghost." Mary Cross pressed the cup into Sarah's hands. The liquid inside was hot and sweet and warmed her from the inside out. "What's your real name, dear?" Mary asked softly. "Sarah Martinez," Sarah replied. Daniel Cross sat down across from her. Well, Sarah Martinez, why don't you tell us what really happened? And don't worry about Morrison. He's got no power here. Sarah told Daniel and Mary Cross everything. She started with overhearing the conversation about the insurance fraud and cattle theft, and continued through Morrison's threats, the forced march into the forest, and her desperate journey to reach their ranch. The words tumbled out of her like water through a broken dam. The Cross family listened without interruption. Daniel's face grew darker with each detail, while Mary made small sounds of sympathy and anger. When Sarah finished her story, the room fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire. "That son of a bitch," Daniel said finally. The crude language seemed out of character for the dignified rancher, but his anger was clearly genuine. Mary placed a gentle hand on Sarah's shoulder. "You're safe now, dear. We'll make sure of that." Sarah wanted to believe them, but years of hard living had taught her to be cautious. "Mr. Cross, I appreciate your kindness, but you don't understand what you're up against. Morrison has money and influence. He owns the sheriff and half the businesses in town. If he finds out I'm here..." Daniel Cross stood up and walked to a gun cabinet in the corner of the room. Inside, Sarah could see several rifles and handguns, all well-maintained and ready for use. "Let me tell you something about Jake Morrison," Cross said as he checked the action on a Winchester rifle. "He thinks his money makes him untouchable, and for the most part, he's been right. But this ranch has been in my family for 30 years, and I've never backed down from a fight." He set the rifle aside and returned to his chair. "Morrison and I've been dancing around each other for years. He's stolen my water, run his cattle on my land, and tried to buy out my neighbors so he could squeeze me from all sides. But he's never crossed the line into attempted murder before." Mary poured herself a cup of coffee and settled into her own chair. "Morrison made a mistake when he hurt you, Sarah. He gave us something concrete to fight him with." Sarah shook her head. "It's my word against his. And I'm just a ranch hand with no family or connections. Who's going to believe me?" Daniel smiled grimly. "You'd be surprised. Morrison has made a lot of enemies over the years. People who would love to see him brought down, but never had the ammunition to do it. Your testimony could be exactly what they've been waiting for." Over the next few days, Sarah learned that the Cross Ranch was very different from the Double M. Where Morrison ruled through fear and intimidation, Daniel Cross led through respect and fairness. His workers were loyal because they were treated well, not because they were afraid of being fired or worse. Mary Cross tended to Sarah's injuries with gentle skill. The cuts on her feet healed cleanly, and proper food and rest restored her strength. But more than that, the kindness the family showed her began to heal wounds that went deeper than physical damage. Sarah had been alone for most of her life. Her mother died when she was young, and her father had been a hard man who showed affection through work and criticism. After his death, Sarah had drifted from job to job, never staying anywhere long enough to form real connections with people. The Cross family made her feel like she belonged somewhere for the first time in years. Daniel spent hours with Sarah, going over every detail of what she had witnessed at the Double M Ranch. He took careful notes and asked probing questions, building a comprehensive picture of Morrison's criminal activities. "The insurance fraud alone would be enough to put him away for years," Daniel explained. "But if we can prove he's been stealing cattle and running them through his brother's operation in Wyoming, that's a federal crime. The territorial marshals would have to get involved." Sarah felt a flicker of hope, but she was still cautious. "Even if we can prove all that, how do we get anyone to listen? Morrison owns the local law." Daniel's smile was predatory. "He owns Sheriff Watson, that's true. But Watson only has jurisdiction in the county. This kind of operation crosses state lines, which means federal law enforcement gets involved. And Morrison doesn't own the territorial marshals." While Daniel worked on the legal aspects of their case, Mary helped Sarah with more practical matters. Sarah's few belongings had been left behind at the Double M Ranch, so Mary provided her with new clothes and necessities. More importantly, Mary listened when Sarah needed to talk about her fears and doubts. I keep thinking I should have just kept quiet, Sarah admitted one afternoon as she helped Mary with the washing. If I hadn't been so curious, none of this would have happened. Mary looked up from the shirt she was scrubbing, and Morrison would still be stealing and cheating, free to hurt other people. You did the right thing, Sarah, even if it cost you. Did I? I nearly died out there. And now I'm putting your family in danger too. Mary set down her washing and took Sarah's hands in her own. My dear, doing the right thing is rarely easy or safe, but it's still the right thing. Morrison thinks he can hurt people without consequences because nobody has ever stood up to him before. You're changing that. Sarah wanted to believe Mary's words, but doubt still gnawed at her. Morrison had resources and connections that seemed impossible to fight. What if their efforts only made things worse? Her doubts seemed justified when, 3 days later, Sheriff Watson showed up at the Circle 7 ranch. Sarah was working in the barn when she heard horses approaching. She looked out and saw Watson and 2 deputies riding up to the main house. Her blood turned to ice. Sarah slipped out the back of the barn and circled around to where she could hear the conversation on the front porch. Afternoon cross, Watson was saying. His voice had the false friendliness of a man delivering a threat. Sheriff, Daniel replied coolly. What brings you out this way? Looking for a missing person. Woman named Sarah Martinez. She worked for Jake Morrison until she disappeared about a week ago. Morrison's concerned about her welfare. Sarah almost laughed at that. Morrison was concerned about her welfare. All right. He was concerned that she might still be alive. Haven't seen anyone by that name, Daniel said. But, then, I don't make a habit of keeping track of Morrison's help. Watson's voice hardened. Now see here, Cross. Morrison says this woman might be dangerous. She stole some money and threatened him before she ran off. If you're harboring her, are you accusing me of something, Sheriff? There was a long pause. Sarah could imagine the 2 men staring each other down on the porch. Just saying you'd best be careful who you trust, Watson said finally. Woman like that, running around alone in the winter, she might do anything to survive. Lie steal may be worse. I'll keep that in mind, Daniel replied. After the sheriff left, Daniel found Sarah hiding behind the barn. Her face was pale and her hands were shaking. He knows I'm here, Sarah said. Morrison must have figured out where I went. Daniel put a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Maybe, or maybe Watson is just fishing, hoping to scare us into giving you up. Either way, it doesn't change anything. But Sarah could see the worry in his eyes, and she knew it changed everything. Morrison was escalating the situation, and that put the Cross family in real danger. That night, Daniel called a family meeting. Along with Mary and Sarah, he included his 2 sons, Michael and James, both grown men who worked the ranch alongside their father. Morrison is making his move, Daniel told them. We all knew this day might come. The question now is how we respond. Michael, the older son, spoke first. We could send Sarah away, help her get to California, or somewhere Morrison can't reach her. And let Morrison win. James shook his head. He'd just go back to stealing and hurting people. Someone else would end up in Sarah's position sooner or later. Mary looked at her husband. What are you thinking, Daniel? Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. I'm thinking it's time we stopped dancing around Jake Morrison and took him down for good. How? Sarah asked. We gather evidence. Real, solid, undeniable proof of what he's been doing. And we take it to people Morrison can't buy or intimidate. Over the next week, Daniel put his plan into action. He sent messages to contacts throughout the territory, men he had known for years who had their own reasons to dislike Morrison. Slowly, a picture began to emerge of Morrison's criminal enterprise. A cattle buyer in Wyoming confirmed that Morrison's brother had been selling cattle with alter brands. A bank clerk in Billings revealed suspicious financial transactions that matched the timeline of Morrison's insurance claims. A former Double M ranch hand, now working in Colorado, agreed to testify about cattle he had seen being driven across state lines in the middle of the night. Each piece of evidence by itself might not have been enough, but Together, they painted a clear picture of organized fraud and theft. The breakthrough came when Daniel received a telegram from an old friend who worked for the territorial marshal's office. The federal authorities have been investigating cattle theft rings throughout the region, and Morrison's name had come up several times. They were very interested in what Sarah had to say. A federal marshal is coming out next week, Daniel told Sarah. His name is William Hayes, and he's been tracking cattle thieves for 10 years. Morrison doesn't own him. Sarah felt a surge of hope, but also fear. What if Morrison finds out? What if he tries to stop the marshal from getting here? Daniel's smile was grim. That's exactly what I'm hoping he'll try. Sarah didn't understand what he meant until 2 days later, when Morrison made his next move. It was just after midnight when the attack came. Sarah woke to the sound of breaking glass and men shouting. She rolled out of bed and crawled to the window, peering out through the curtains. The barn was on fire. Dark figures moved around the ranch buildings, and Sarah could see the flash of gunfire. The Cross family was fighting back, shooting from the house and other defensive positions around the ranch. Sarah grabbed the rifle Daniel had given her and made her way downstairs. The main room was in chaos, with Mary reloading weapons while Daniel and his sons fired out the windows. "How many?" Sarah asked as she took a position near the back door. "At least 6, Michael replied without taking his eyes off the target he was aiming at. "Maybe more." A bullet shattered a window near Sarah's head, spraying her with glass. She ducked down and tried to spot the shooter in the darkness outside. The battle lasted nearly an hour. Morrison's men had the advantage of surprise, but the Cross family knew their own land and had prepared for this possibility. Gradually, the attackers were driven back. When the shooting finally stopped, 3 of Morrison's men lay dead in the yard. The rest had fled, including Morrison himself, who Sarah had glimpsed directing the attack from horseback. The barn was a total loss, along with most of the hay and grain stored inside. 2 of the Cross ranch hands had been wounded, though not seriously. But they had survived, and they had proof of Morrison's escalation to outright violence. "He's desperate," Daniel said as they surveyed the damage by morning light. Men like Morrison don't usually risk open warfare unless they're cornered. Mary bandaged a cut on Daniel's arm, while Sarah helped gather evidence from the attack. Shell casings, blood trails, and abandoned equipment would all help build their case. But Morrison wasn't finished. The next morning brought Sheriff Watson and a posse of deputies, demanding to search the ranch for Sarah. "I've got a warrant," Watson announced, waving a piece of paper. "Sarah Martinez is wanted for arson and attempted murder. Seems she tried to burn down Morrison's ranch house last night." Daniel looked at the warrant carefully. "This is dated yesterday afternoon, Sheriff, before the fire at my barn. Interesting timing." Watson's face reddened. "Don't get smart with me, Cross. That woman is dangerous, and I'm going to find her." "Search away," Daniel replied. "But you won't find anyone here who doesn't belong." Sarah was hidden in a root cellar beneath the kitchen floor, breathing through a concealed air vent while Watson's men tore the house apart looking for her. They found nothing because Daniel and his sons had prepared the hiding place years earlier during their first serious conflict with Morrison. After the posse left empty-handed, Daniel helped Sarah out of the cellar. "This can't go on much longer," Sarah said. "Morrison is going to keep escalating until someone gets killed." Daniel nodded grimly. "I know, but Marshal Hayes will be here tomorrow. Once we get our evidence to him, Morrison won't be able to hide behind corrupt local officials anymore." That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She stood at her bedroom window, looking out at the charred remains of the barn and thinking about the violence that had erupted because of her testimony. Good people were suffering because she had chosen to speak up about Morrison's crimes. Maybe it would be better if she just disappeared. She could slip away in the night, head for California or Oregon, and start over with a new name. Morrison would have no reason to threaten the Cross family anymore. But even as she considered it, Sarah knew she couldn't do it. Mary Cross was right. Morrison thought he could hurt people without consequences because nobody had ever stood up to him before. Running away would just confirm his belief that he was untouchable. Sarah had started something that was bigger than just her own survival now. Other people had been drawn into the fight, but they had chosen to join it because they believed it was right. She owed it to them to see it through to the end. The next morning brought Marshal William Hayes. He was a lean, weathered man in his 50s with intelligent gray eyes and the kind of quiet confidence that came from years of facing down dangerous criminals. He rode up to the Circle 7 ranch alone, which surprised Sarah. "Where are your deputies?" Daniel asked as he greeted the marshal. Hayes smiled slightly. "Don't have any with me. Found it's better to travel light when you're investigating corruption. Never know who might be passing information to the wrong people." Hayes spent the entire day interviewing Sarah, going over every detail of what she had witnessed at the Double M Ranch. He asked pointed questions and took careful notes, building a comprehensive picture of Morrison's criminal activities. "Your testimony matches intelligence we've been gathering for months," Hayes told Sarah. "Morrison has been running cattle through a network that spans 3 territories. The insurance fraud is just one part of a much larger operation." Daniel showed Hayes the evidence they had collected from Morrison's attack on the ranch. The marshal examined the shell casings and blood samples with professional interest. "This escalation to violence actually helps our case," Hayes explained. "It shows Morrison's state of mind and his willingness to eliminate witnesses. A jury will understand what kind of man we're dealing with." But Hayes also brought sobering news. "Morrison knows I'm here. He's got people watching the roads, and he's been spreading money around town to buy silence and support. We need to move fast before he tries to silence more witnesses." As if summoned by Hayes's words, one of Morrison's men rode up to the ranch house that afternoon. But instead of attacking, he came under a white flag, carrying a message from his boss. The message was simple and direct. Morrison wanted to meet with Sarah alone to discuss their misunderstanding. If she agreed, he would call off his campaign against the Cross family and guarantee her safe passage out of the territory. "It's a trap," Mary said immediately. "That man has no honor. He'll kill you the moment you're alone with him." Hayes nodded agreement. Morrison is desperate enough to try anything now. Meeting with him would be suicide. But Sarah saw an opportunity in Morrison's desperation. What if it wasn't really alone? What if Marshal Hayes and some of your men were hidden nearby? Daniel shook his head. "Too dangerous. Morrison will have his own men positioned around any meeting place." "Maybe," Sarah said, "but he's also arrogant enough to think he can handle one woman by himself. And if we can get him talking, get him to admit what he's done where Marshal Hayes can hear it." Hayes was intrigued despite his caution. "It could work, but the risk to you would be enormous." Sarah thought about the burned barn, the terrified expressions on Mary's face during the attack, the blood of Morrison's victims staining the snow. "I'm already at risk. We all are. At least this way, we might be able to end it." The plan they worked out was dangerous, but simple. Sarah would agree to meet Morrison at a neutral location, an old line shack about halfway between the 2 ranches Hayes, and the Crossmen would be hidden in the surrounding forest, close enough to intervene if things went wrong, but far enough away to avoid detection. Most importantly, Hayes would position himself where he could overhear any conversation between Sarah and Morrison. If Morrison confessed to his crimes, Hayes would have the testimony of a federal law enforcement officer to support Sarah's accusations. The meeting was set for the next evening. As the sun began to set, Sarah rode toward what might be her final confrontation with Jake Morrison. Behind her, invisible in the forest shadows, Marshal Hayes and the Crossmen followed at a distance. Sarah tried to calm her racing heart as the line shack came into view. Morrison was already there, standing beside his horse with his arms folded across his chest. He looked calm and confident, like a man who held all the cards. "Hello, Sarah," Morrison said as she dismounted. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't come." "I'm here," Sarah replied. "Let's talk." Morrison gestured toward the small shack. "Shall we step inside? It's warmer, and we can speak privately." Sarah shook her head. "I'm comfortable here." She needed to stay in the open where Hayes could see and hear everything that happened. Morrison shrugged. "Suit yourself. Though I thought you might appreciate getting out of the cold considering your recent experience with winter weather. The casual reference to her barefoot flight through the snow made Sarah's blood run cold. But she forced herself to remain calm. "What do you want, Morrison?" Morrison walked closer, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. Sarah noticed he was wearing a gun, but then most men in this territory carried weapons as a matter of course. "I want to make a deal," Morrison said. "You've caused me a lot of trouble, Sarah, but I'm willing to let bygones be bygones." "What kind of deal?" Morrison smiled, but his eyes remained hard. "Simple. You leave the territory. Tonight. I'll give you $500 and a horse, enough to get you anywhere you want to go. In exchange, you forget whatever you think you saw at my ranch." Sarah pretended to consider the offer. "And if I don't agree?" Morrison's smile faded. "Then, things get unpleasant for everyone involved. The Cross family has been very kind to you, Sarah. It would be a shame if something happened to them. Like what happened to their barn." Morrison's eyes flickered with surprise, then anger. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you do. You led the attack yourself. I saw you directing your men from horseback." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying Sarah's face. "You're trying to get me to confess something. Are you wearing a wire, Sarah? Or maybe you've got friends listening nearby." Sarah's heart jumped, but she kept her expression neutral. "I don't know what you mean." Morrison laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Of course you do. You're working with that federal marshal, aren't you? Hayes." "Yes, I know he's here. I make it my business to know who's moving through my territory." "This isn't your territory, Morrison. This is free land." "Nothing is free, Sarah. Everything has a price, and everyone can be bought. Even federal marshals, if you offer them enough." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air. "You're lying." Morrison reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Marshal William Hayes, currently investigating cattle theft in the Montana Territory. Divorced. 2 children living with his ex-wife in Chicago. Makes $60 a month and sends most of it back east. A man with financial problems is often willing to compromise his principles." He held out the paper to Sarah. "Go ahead, read it. It's a full report on your marshal friend, compiled by some associates of mine in the territorial capital." Sarah's hand shook as she took the paper and unfolded it. It was indeed a detailed report on Hayes, including personal information that wouldn't be publicly available. Information that could only have come from someone with connections in high places. "How do I know this is real?" Sarah asked, though her heart was sinking. "You don't," Morrison replied. "But ask yourself this. Why would a federal marshal come out here alone? Why not bring a full team of deputies? And why hasn't he arrested me yet, if he has all this evidence you claim to have given him?" Sarah's mind raced. Hayes had explained his decision to travel alone as a security measure, to prevent information from leaking to the wrong people. But what if the real reason was different? What if he was working with Morrison from the beginning? "I can see you're starting to understand," Morrison said softly. "Hayes has been keeping me informed of every move you people have made. The hiding place in the cellar, your testimony about the cattle operation, even the plan for this meeting tonight." If Morrison was telling the truth, then Sarah had walked into a trap. Hayes wasn't hidden in the forest to protect her. He was there to make sure she didn't leave alive. "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked. Morrison moved closer. "Because I want you to understand how completely you've lost. Your protectors have betrayed you. Your evidence will never see the inside of a courtroom. And your friends at the Circle 7 ranch are going to pay the price for crossing me." Sarah backed away, her hand moving instinctively toward the knife she carried on her belt. "The Cross family never did anything to you. They harbored a fugitive. They attacked my men when I came to retrieve my stolen property. And they made the mistake of thinking they could stand up to me." Morrison's voice grew colder. "I'm going to burn that ranch to the ground, Sarah. I'm going to kill Daniel Cross and his sons, and I'm going to let my men have some fun with his wife before I finish her off." Rage flared in Sarah's chest. "You bastard." Morrison smiled. "There she is. The real Sarah Martinez. Not the frightened little mouse who's been hiding behind other people's protection, but the woman who survived 6 days in the wilderness with nothing but determination and spite." He was right. and Sarah realized that Morrison had been manipulating the entire conversation to bring out her anger. He wanted her to attack him, wanted her to give him an excuse to kill her in what would look like self-defense. But Morrison had made a mistake. In his arrogance, he had revealed too much. "You're wrong about one thing," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her fear. "What's that?" "Marshall Hayes isn't working for you." Morrison frowned. "Of course he is. I just explained." "No, you explained that you have a report about him. A report that could have been compiled by anyone about anyone. You want me to believe Hayes is corrupt because it makes me feel hopeless and alone." Sarah took a step forward. "But if Hayes was really working for you, why would you need to meet with me at all? You could have just had him arrest me on false charges or kill me and claim I was resisting. The fact that you're here, trying to make a deal, tells me you don't control him." Morrison's confident expression flickered. "You're grasping at straws." "Am I? Then why haven't your men moved in to surround us? If this was really a trap, if Hayes was really corrupt, your people would already be in position." Sarah was gambling everything on her reading of Morrison's character. He was arrogant and ruthless, but he was also careful. If he had really corrupted Hayes, he would have planned this meeting very differently. Morrison's hand moved toward his gun. "Enough games." "I agree," said a voice from behind him. "Enough games." Morrison spun around to find Marshall Hayes emerging from shadows, his own weapon drawn, and pointed at Morrison's chest. "William Hayes, Territorial Marshal," Hayes said formally. "Jake Morrison, you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, cattle theft, arson, and attempted murder." Morrison's face twisted with rage. "This is impossible." "My sources said." "Your sources lied," Hayes replied. "We've been feeding false information through channels we knew you were monitoring. The report about my financial troubles? Complete fiction. The idea that I came here alone? Also false. I've got 6 deputies positioned around this area, and they've been listening to every word you've said, as if summoned by his words. Armed men stepped out of concealment around the clearing. Morrison found himself surrounded, with no avenue of escape. You confessed to fraud, cattle theft, arson, and threatening the lives of witnesses, Hayes continued, in front of a federal law enforcement officer and multiple witnesses. That's going to make the trial very short. Morrison's shoulders sagged as he realized how thoroughly he had been outmaneuvered. The report about you, it seemed so detailed. It was detailed, Hayes agreed. We put a lot of effort into making it convincing. Had to make sure you'd believe I was corrupt enough to work with you. Sarah felt weak with relief. The plan had worked, but it had been far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. If she had been wrong about Hayes, if Morrison really had corrupted the marshal, she would be dead now. "How did you know?" Hayes asked her as his deputies secured Morrison with handcuffs. "What made you certain I wasn't working for him?" Sarah thought about it. Morrison is smart, but he's also arrogant. If he had really owned you, he wouldn't have been able to resist gloating about it. He would have had you here to witness my defeat. The fact that he was trying to convince me you were corrupt, instead of just having you arrest me, told me he was lying. Hayes nodded with approval. Good instincts. Morrison's ego has always been his weakness. As the deputies led Morrison away, he turned back to Sarah one last time. "This isn't over. I've got lawyers, connections, money. I'll be out in a year, and when I am—" "No," Hayes interrupted. "You won't. The evidence we've collected spans multiple territories and involves federal crimes. You're looking at decades in prison, assuming you don't hang for attempted murder." Morrison's face went pale. For the first time since Sarah had known him, the arrogant rancher looked genuinely afraid. The ride back to the Circle 7 ranch was quiet. Sarah found herself emotionally drained by the confrontation and its aftermath. She had spent weeks living in fear of Morrison, and now that the threat was removed, she felt hollow and empty. Hayes rode beside her, occasionally glancing over with concern. "Are you all right?" Sarah nodded. "Just tired. It's hard to believe it's really over." "The immediate danger is over," Hayes agreed. "But there's still the trial to get through. Morrison's lawyers will try to discredit your testimony and challenge the evidence. Will it be enough? What we have, I mean. Hayes smiled. More than enough. Morrison's confession tonight sealed his fate. Even if his lawyers managed to exclude some of the other evidence, we have him on record admitting to multiple felonies in front of federal law enforcement. When they reached the ranch, the Cross family was waiting on the porch. Mary ran down to meet them, her face bright with relief and joy. "Thank God you're safe," she said, embracing Sarah. "We heard the gunshots and thought." "No gunshots," Sarah assured her. Morrison surrendered without a fight once he realized he was surrounded. Daniel appeared at Mary's shoulder, his face grave. "What happens now?" Hayes dismounted and accepted the cup of coffee that Mary offered him. "Now we prepare for trial. Morrison will be transported to the territorial capital for arraignment. The trial will probably take place in about 3 months." "What about his men?" Daniel asked. "The ones who attacked our ranch? We'll round them up over the next few days," Hayes replied. "Some of them will probably agree to testify against Morrison in exchange for reduced sentences. Men like Butler and Hayes, his inner circle, they're looking at serious prison time." Over the next week, Hayes's prediction proved accurate. The deputies rounded up most of Morrison's men without serious resistance. A few had fled the territory, but the majority were captured and charged with various crimes. Frank Butler, Morrison's foreman, was the first to break. Faced with charges that could put him away for 20 years, he agreed to testify about the cattle operation and the insurance fraud. His detailed knowledge of Morrison's business filled in gaps in the prosecution's case and provided corroboration for Sarah's testimony. Tom Hayes, no relation to the marshal, was less cooperative. He refused to talk and hired an expensive lawyer from Denver to defend him. But his defiance didn't help him much. Too many witnesses had seen him participate in the attack on the Circle 7 ranch, and his connection to Morrison's criminal enterprise was well documented. Sheriff Watson tried to claim he had been duped by Morrison, but Hayes wasn't buying it. "You carried a false warrant," the marshal told Watson during his arrest. "You participated in an attempted frame-up of a federal witness. You're going to prison along with the rest of them." The territorial governor, pressured by publicity surrounding the case, appointed a special prosecutor to handle the trials. Morrison's influence in local politics had been broken, and honest law enforcement officers were finally able to do their jobs without interference. But even with Morrison in custody, Sarah found it difficult to relax. She had lived with fear and danger for so long that peace felt unnatural. She jumped at unexpected sounds and found herself constantly checking the windows and doors of the ranch house. Mary Cross noticed her nervousness and tried to help. "It takes time," she told Sarah during one of their conversations. "When you've been hurt the way you have, it's hard to believe you're really safe." "I keep expecting Morrison's men to show up," Sarah admitted. "Or for Morrison himself to escape somehow. He's in a federal jail under heavy guard," Mary reminded her. "And most of his men are either captured or on the run." "You're safe, Sarah." Intellectually, Sarah knew Mary was right. But emotionally, she couldn't shake the feeling that the danger was still out there, waiting for her to let down her guard. The feeling began to fade as the weeks passed, and no new threats materialized. Sarah threw herself into work around the ranch, helping to rebuild the barn that Morrison's men had burned and taking on additional responsibilities with the livestock. The physical work helped calm her mind, and the routine of ranch life provided a sense of normalcy she hadn't experienced in months. She was good at the work, and the Cross family valued her contributions. As the trial date approached, Sarah began to think about her future. She had been drifting from job to job for years before coming to Montana, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. But the Circle 7 ranch felt different. It felt like home. Daniel and Mary had made it clear that she was welcome to stay as long as she wanted. They offered her a permanent position as a ranch hand, with wages that were better than anything she had earned before. More importantly, they offered her something she had never really had, a place where she belonged. But Sarah knew that accepting their offer would mean testifying against Morrison at trial. She would have to face him again, this time in a courtroom full of people, and relive the worst moments of her ordeal in front of jury. The thought terrified her, but she knew she had to do it. Too many people had risked too much to bring Morrison to justice. She owed it to them, and to herself, to see it through to the end. 3 weeks before the trial, Sarah made her decision. She would stay in Montana. She would testify against Morrison. And afterward, she would build a new life at the Circle 7 ranch with people who had proven they cared about her. That night, she told the Cross family about her decision. Daniel smiled and shook her hand formally, welcoming her as a permanent member of the ranch family. Mary cried a little and hugged her tightly. "I'm so glad," Mary whispered. "This ranch needs someone like you. And I think you need us too." Sarah nodded, surprised to find herself crying as well. "Thank you for everything. I don't know what would have happened to me if—" "Don't think about that," Mary interrupted gently. "Think about the future, about the life you're going to build here." For the first time in years, Sarah had a future to look forward to. The trial would be difficult, but it would also mark the end of her ordeal and the beginning of something new. Morrison had tried to destroy her, to break her spirit, and leave her dead in the snow. Instead, he had pushed her toward a better life than she had ever imagined possible. In his arrogance and cruelty, Morrison had created his own downfall. And in trying to silence Sarah Martinez, he had instead given her a voice that would help bring him to justice. The trial was still ahead, with all the challenges and uncertainties that entailed. But Sarah was no longer the frightened woman who had stumbled barefoot through the forest, desperate and alone. She was home now, surrounded by people who valued her for who she was. Morrison had taken a lot from her, but he had also inadvertently given her something precious: the knowledge that she was stronger than she had ever realized, and the understanding that some things were worth fighting for, no matter the cost. As Sarah looked out at the snow-covered fields of the Circle 7 ranch, she felt a deep sense of peace. The ghost prince Morrison's men had tried to follow had led them nowhere. But Sarah's real footprints, the ones that marked her journey from victim to survivor to something more, those would last forever. She was ready for whatever came next. The territorial capital of Helena bustled with activity as people gathered for what newspapers were calling the trial of the decade. Jake Morrison's arrest had sent shockwaves through the Montana Territory, and his trial promised to expose a web of corruption that reached into the highest levels of local government. Sarah arrived in Helena 3 days before the trial was scheduled to begin. Marshal Hayes had arranged for her protection during the proceedings, and she stayed in a small hotel under an assumed name with 2 deputy marshals posted discreetly nearby. The city felt overwhelming after months at the quiet Circle 7 ranch. The noise, the crowds, and the constant bustle made Sarah nervous. She found herself jumping at sudden sounds and scanning faces in the crowd, looking for threats that probably weren't there. Daniel and Mary Cross had come to Helena to support her during the trial. Their presence helped calm Sarah's nerves, but she could see the worry in their eyes. They knew how difficult the coming days would be for her. "The prosecutor says Morrison's lawyers will try to attack your character," Daniel warned her during one of their meetings. "They'll paint you as a disgruntled employee with a grudge against your former boss." Sarah nodded grimly. "Hayes warned me about that. He says the key is to stick to the facts and not let them provoke me into losing my temper." "You'll do fine," Mary assured her. "Just tell the truth. The jury will see who you really are." But Sarah wasn't so confident. Morrison had hired the best legal team money could buy, led by a famous defense attorney named Hamilton Pierce, who had a reputation for destroying prosecution witnesses on cross-examination. Pierce had already given interviews to the local newspapers, suggesting that Sarah was an unreliable witness with questionable motives. The night before jury selection began, Sarah couldn't sleep. She stood at the window of her hotel room, looking out at the dark streets and thinking about the ordeal ahead. Tomorrow, her private nightmare would become public, dissected, and examined by strangers who would judge every word she spoke. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Sarah tensed until she heard Mary Cross's voice. "Sarah, dear, may I come in?" Sarah opened the door to find Mary holding a tray with tea and sandwiches. "I thought you might be hungry, and maybe in need of some company." They sat together in the small room, not talking much, but finding comfort in each other's presence. Mary had become like a mother to Sarah over the past few months, offering the kind of unconditional support that Sarah had never experienced before. "I keep thinking about that night in the forest," Sarah said finally, "when Morrison's men were chasing me through the snow. I was so scared and cold and alone. I never imagined it would lead to this." Mary poured more tea into Sarah's cup. That frightened girl in the forest was braver than she knew. She chose to run toward help instead of just hiding. That choice led her to us, and now it's going to lead to justice. What if the jury doesn't believe me? What if Morrison's lawyers convince them I'm lying? Mary took Sarah's hands in hers. "Then we'll deal with that when it happens. But I don't think it will. You're telling the truth, and the truth has a way of making itself known." The first day of trial began with jury selection. Sarah sat in the gallery, watching as potential jurors were questioned about their knowledge of the case and their ability to be impartial. Morrison sat at the defense table in an expensive suit, looking confident and composed. He nodded politely to people he recognized in the courtroom and spoke quietly with his lawyers. It was hard to reconcile this well-dressed, respectable-looking man with the person who had threatened to kill her and driven her barefoot into the wilderness. Morrison was playing a role, presenting himself as a successful businessman who was the victim of false accusations. Hamilton Pierce, Morrison's lead attorney, was a distinguished-looking man in his 60s with silver hair and a commanding presence. During jury selection, he emphasized the presumption of innocence and the prosecution's burden to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. "Ladies and gentlemen," Pierce told the potential jurors, "my client stands accused of serious crimes based largely on the testimony of a single witness. A witness who admits she was employed by my client and had access to his private conversations and business records. I ask only that you listen carefully to all the evidence before you make your decision." The prosecutor, a territorial attorney named Robert Sterling, took a different approach. He focused on the evidence, reminding the jury that they would hear not just Sarah's testimony, but also corroborating evidence from multiple sources. "This is not a case that depends on one person's word," Sterling told the jury. "This is a case built on documents, financial records, and testimony from multiple witnesses who will describe a pattern of criminal behavior spanning several years." It took 2 days to select 12 jurors and 2 alternates. The final jury included ranchers, merchants, a blacksmith, and a schoolteacher. All were men, as women were not allowed to serve on juries in the Montana Territory. Sarah tried to read their faces as they were sworn in, looking for signs of sympathy or hostility. Most appeared serious and attentive, but she couldn't predict how they would react to her testimony. The prosecution's opening statement painted a picture of Morrison as a criminal mastermind who used his position and resources to steal cattle, defraud insurance companies, and intimidate anyone who threatened to expose him. "The evidence will show," Sterling declared, "that Jake Morrison built his wealth through a systematic campaign of theft and fraud. When Sarah Martinez accidentally discovered his crimes, Morrison didn't hesitate to try to silence her permanently. The defendant's own words, spoken to the victim and overheard by federal law enforcement officers, will prove his guilt beyond any reasonable doubt." Pierce's opening statement portrayed Morrison as a successful rancher who was being targeted by a disgruntled employee with a grudge. "Sarah Martinez worked for my client for 3 years," Pierce told the jury. During that time, she had access to confidential business information and private conversations. When her employment was terminated for cause, she fabricated these accusations as revenge against a man who had treated her fairly and paid her well. Pierce was skilled at planting seeds of doubt without making specific accusations he couldn't prove. He suggested that Sarah had been romantically interested in Morrison and felt rejected when he didn't return her feelings. He implied that she had been stealing from the ranch and was facing prosecution when she invented her story about overhearing criminal conversations. None of it was true, but Pierce presented these theories with enough confidence to make them sound plausible to someone who didn't know the facts. The prosecution began its case with Frank Butler, Morrison's former foreman. Butler had agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced sentence, and his insider knowledge of Morrison's operation was devastating. Butler described the cattle theft operation in detail, explaining how Morrison's men would steal cattle from neighboring ranches and drive them across state lines to be sold through Morrison's brother's connections in Wyoming. He testified about the insurance fraud scheme, providing specific dates and amounts that matched perfectly with records subpoenaed from the insurance company. Pierce's cross-examination of Butler was brutal. He attacked Butler's credibility, pointing out that he was a convicted criminal who had received favorable treatment in exchange for his testimony. "Mr. Butler," Pierce said, his voice dripping with disdain, "isn't it true that you were facing 20 years in prison before you agreed to testify against my client?" "Yes, sir," Butler admitted. "And isn't it true that by testifying against Mr. Morrison, you hope to reduce your sentence to perhaps 5 years?" "That's what the prosecutor offered, yes." Pierce smiled coldly. "So you have every incentive to say whatever the prosecution wants to hear, regardless of whether it's true." Butler's jaw tightened. "I'm telling the truth because it's the truth. Morrison was stealing cattle and cheating insurance companies. I helped him do it, and I'm paying the price for that. Or you're lying to save your own skin and hoping this jury is gullible enough to believe you." Butler's face reddened with anger, which was exactly what Pierce wanted. An angry witness looked less credible to a jury. The prosecution spent 3 days presenting documentary evidence that supported Butler's testimony. Financial records, insurance claims, and cattle sale receipts created a paper trail that clearly showed Morrison's criminal activities. Pierce objected frequently, arguing that the documents were taken out of context or misinterpreted by prosecution witnesses. He couldn't challenge the authenticity of the records, but he could try to confuse the jury about their meaning. On the 4th day of trial, Sarah took the witness stand. The courtroom was packed with spectators, reporters, and curiosity seekers. Sarah could feel their eyes on her as she walked to the witness box and placed her hand on the Bible to be sworn in. "Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" the clerk asked. "I do," Sarah replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Sterling began with basic questions about her background and employment at the Double M Ranch. Sarah described her work with the horses and her reputation as a reliable employee. "During your 3 years of employment with the defendant, did you have any problems with Mr. Morrison?" "No, sir. I did my job and stayed out of trouble." "Did you have any romantic interest in the defendant?" "No, sir. Absolutely not." Sterling walked Sarah through the events of that terrible night, from overhearing Morrison's conversation about the insurance fraud to her escape into the forest. Sarah spoke clearly and calmly, sticking to the facts as Hayes had advised her. "Can you describe the condition you were in when Mr. Morrison's men forced you to leave the ranch?" Sarah took a breath. "This was the hardest part. They took my boots and socks. I was wearing only a thin dress. The snow was deep, and the temperature was well below freezing." "How long were you in the wilderness?" 6 days. "How did you survive?" "I found an abandoned cabin and was able to start a fire. I wrapped my feet in rags and foraged for whatever food I could find." Sterling had Sarah describe her journey to the Circle 7 Ranch and her eventual meeting with Daniel Cross. The jury listened intently as she explained how the Cross family had taken her in and protected her from Morrison's attempts to silence her. "Did there come a time when you agreed to meet with the defendant to discuss your situation?" "Yes, sir. Marshal Hayes arranged for the meeting as part of a plan to get Mr. Morrison to confess to his crimes." "Can you tell the jury what the defendant said to you during that meeting?" Sarah recounted Morrison's threats against the Cross family and his admission of the crime she had witnessed. She quoted his words as accurately as she could remember them, describing how he had bragged about owning the local sheriff and threatened to kill Daniel Cross and assault Mary Cross. The courtroom was completely silent as Sarah finished her testimony. Several jurors were staring at Morrison with expressions of disgust and anger. Sterling concluded his direct examination by asking, "Miss Martinez, why did you agree to testify against the defendant, knowing the risks involved?" Sarah looked directly at the jury. "Because what he did was wrong, and someone needed to speak up." Morrison thought he could hurt people without consequences because nobody had ever stood up to him before. "I couldn't let that continue." Pierce's cross-examination began immediately after a brief recess. Sarah had been dreading this moment for weeks, knowing that Morrison's lawyer would try to destroy her credibility and paint her as a liar and opportunist. Pierce started with seemingly innocent questions about Sarah's background and family history. But Sarah could sense he was building towards something, gathering information he would use to attack her character. "Miss Martinez, you testified that you grew up in Texas. What was your father's occupation?" "He was a ranch hand, like me." "And your mother?" "She died when I was young." Pierce consulted his notes. "According to my investigation, your father was known to have a drinking problem. Is that correct?" Sterling objected. "Relevance, Your Honor?" "I'll allow it," the judge replied. "You may answer, Miss Martinez." Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks. "My father had his struggles, yes. And he died owing substantial debts, leaving you with nothing." "That's correct." Pierce smiled slightly. "So when you came to Montana, you're desperate for work and money." "I needed a job, yes. Most people do." "Indeed. And Mr. Morrison provided you with steady employment and fair wages for 3 years." "Yes." Pierce walked closer to the witness stand. "Yet you claim he threatened to kill you over a simple misunderstanding." Sarah met his eyes steadily. "It wasn't a misunderstanding. I overheard him discussing criminal activities, and he wanted to silence me. Or perhaps you were caught eavesdropping on a private conversation and tried to blackmail your employer." "No, that's not what happened." Pierce's voice grew sharper. "Isn't it true that you demanded money from Mr. Morrison in exchange for your silence?" "No." "Isn't it true that when he refused your demands, you threatened to make false accusations against him?" "No." Pierce pressed harder. "Isn't it true that you fabricated this entire story because you were angry at being fired from your job?" Sarah's temper flared, but she remembered Hayes's advice about staying calm. "I wasn't fired. I was threatened and then driven into the wilderness to die, according to you. But we have only your word for these dramatic claims, don't we?" Sterling stood up. "Objection. The witness has already testified about other witnesses and evidence." "Sustained," the judge ruled. Pierce continued his attack, questioning every detail of Sarah's story and suggesting alternative explanations for the evidence. He painted her as an unreliable witness who had been coached by the prosecution to support their case. "Miss Martinez, you've spent months living with the Cross family, haven't you?" "Yes." "And they provided you with food, shelter, and employment?" "Yes." "So you have a financial incentive to tell them what they want to hear?" Sarah's anger was building despite her efforts to remain calm. "The Cross family took me in because it was the right thing to do, not because they wanted something from me." "How convenient." "And now you're testifying against their business rival, helping them eliminate competition in the area." "That's not why I'm testifying." Pierce smiled coldly. "Isn't it? You've admitted you need money and employment. The Cross family has provided both. Testifying against Jake Morrison serves their interests as much as your own." Sarah felt the trap Pierce was setting, but she couldn't see a way out of it. Anything she said could be twisted to support his theory that she was lying for personal gain. "I'm testifying because Jake Morrison committed crimes and tried to kill me to cover them up," Sarah said firmly. "That's the truth, regardless of what you try to make it sound like." Pierce spent another hour questioning every aspect of Sarah's testimony, looking for inconsistencies or contradictions he could exploit. But Sarah had told the truth, and the truth was consistent. Pierce couldn't shake her story because it was real. Finally, Pierce attempted one last attack on Sarah's credibility. "Miss Martinez, Have you been promised anything by the prosecution in exchange for your testimony? No. No money, no special treatment, no immunity from prosecution? Sarah frowned. Immunity from what? I haven't committed any crimes. Pierce raised an eyebrow. Haven't you? You've admitted to eavesdropping on private conversations. In some jurisdictions, that could be considered a crime. Sterling objected immediately. Your Honor, defense counsel is making legal arguments that are not supported by the law in this territory. Sustained. Move on, Mr. Pierce. Pierce's expression showed his frustration. He had tried every angle he could think of to discredit Sarah, but she had held up under pressure. Her story remained consistent and credible. No further questions, Pierce said finally. Sterling stood for redirect examination. Miss Martinez, Mr. Pierce suggested that you're testifying because the Cross family has provided for you. Let me ask you this. If testifying against Mr. Morrison would somehow harm the Cross family, would you still be here today? Sarah didn't hesitate. Yes. What Morrison did was wrong, regardless of how it affects anyone else. And if you could have avoided this entire ordeal by simply keeping quiet about what you witnessed, would you have made that choice? Sarah thought about the question seriously. Before this happened, I might have. I was used to keeping my head down and avoiding